In this video, we're going to start a new project in Android Studio, but more importantly, we're going to answer some questions on what are all these prompts that I have to fill out when I am creating a new Android Studio project, and what relevance does that have to the Google Play Store, where people are going to go download an application. So in this video, I'm going to start a new project, but I'm also going to show how these configuration files are reflected in the Google Play Store. And for that last step, I will use Plant Places Mobile, which is an application that I have deployed in the Google Play Store, so we can see some statistics around there. So first of all, when we start a new project, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to jump over here to Android Studio, and what we're looking at here is the source code for that project that I just showed in the Play Store, plantplaces.com mobile. So I've opened Android Studio. Let's say I want to start a new project. I'm going to go to File, and then New, and then we're going to say New Project, and it's going to walk us through a series of steps here, and this is what I want to start to describe. Now, the first question is, what exactly are we filling out? And you see, it's a series of kind of wizard screens. I can go backwards and forwards a little bit just to kind of show you where we're going to go. Essentially, what we're doing is we're populating a file called build.gradle. We're also creating several files. So before I jump in and actually start typing into this form, let me just give you a little overview of what build.gradle is and the other files that are getting generated. So build.gradle. Why is this file important? Well, it's essentially our build script. It's telling us how to turn all of our source code and all of our resources, all of our images, all of our XML files into an APK, essentially a deployable Android project. Now, what's important about that is not only is it how we build, but it's also how we set up dependencies. And I'll tell you this, it's one thing to be an Android programmer, but it's really kind of another level to understand the libraries that you can use to help you write better applications and write them faster. So above the core of just knowing how to write Android code, it's also a good idea to have a nice portfolio of libraries that you want to introduce to your project. Things like Glide, Butterknife, Dagger. These are ones that I hear of quite a bit, and of course I'll do a few videos on those as well. So we configure those dependencies in our build.gradle. We also have some things called our application ID, which is one of our most important assets that we have as an Android app developer. Why is that? Because the application ID is what you see here in this URL. It is the unique identifier for our application. And you see that the ID for plantplaces.com mobile is, guess what? com.plantplaces. Now this is one of two apps I currently have on the Play Store. The other one's Plant Flashcards, and take a look at that application that application ID. It's com.plantflashcards. So that kind of syntax, that com.plantflashcards might ring a bell. No worries, we will come back to that in just a moment. The reason I say this is your biggest asset is take a look down here. You see these ratings. Of course, we like 5s, not so cool on 1s, but these ratings are tied to that app ID. If you happen to write a low-quality app and you get a lot of bad ratings, there's only one thing to do, and that is change that application ID. That's the only way you can get rid of old ratings, at least to my knowledge. If you know a better way, by all means, leave a comment in the video. I'd love to see it. minSdkVersion, targetSdkVersion. So what's the minimum version we'll support? What's the target we'll support? VersionCode and versionName. Those versionCode and versionName are the version of our software, where the two attributes above, the SDK version, is the version of the Android operating system. So those are the differences there in build.gradle. Okay, the Google Play Store we just looked at, we'll look at that a bit more. Now, it's also going to create, if we want, a default activity. So we have to think the package name for that default activity. An activity, by the way, like a screen, something that you can interact with on the Android platform. We have to know, do we want to do it Java or Kotlin? And in the latest versions of Android, it's going to generate 2 different XML files that are used for the layout. Why 2? There used to be just one. Why 2? Well, because of material design. Material design wants to think of our screen in layers. So the activity is essentially kind of an upper layer that has things like the floating action bar, where, and probably easier to see that actually with the application. Content are all of the other widgets we're going to put on the screen, all the buttons, all the text views, and everything else. These are in two different XML files because essentially that floating action bar is independent of the layout of the components. So in other words, you don't have to, when you're putting your buttons and your text boxes on the screen, you don't have to leave room for the floating action button because it is in an entirely different layout file. Okay, with that, let's jump in, and I've described what we're going to take a look at. Let's now actually do it. So this application I'm going to call Plant Places. Company domain, I've already used com.plantplaces. That is a domain that I own, so I don't want to reuse that. Instead, I'll use the University of Cincinnati's address. So company domain is typically the your website, your URL. Now, careful here, because I'm going to say uc.edu, and take a look at what happens down in package name. It makes something called edu.uc.plantplaces. Okay, so it reversed UC and EDU, which is common for a package name. It's usually your domain name in reverse. And then it added this application name to it, Plant Places. So a package name, think of a package like a series of folders that hold our classes. A package name should be unique. And for that reason, we'll typically start with the company domain in reverse. So uc.edu would be edu.uc. Plantplaces.com would be com.plantplaces. But that might not be enough to make something unique. So for example, there are 40-some thousand students at the University of Cincinnati, all of whom can claim this uc.edu domain. So we really should make something that's a little bit more unique than that. And one thing we consider is what makes a user unique within this domain. At the University of Cincinnati, all students have a Bearcat ID, which is the first 6 letters of your last name, your first initial and middle initial. I've had the same Bearcat ID since I was a student back in the year 2000, so something I've had with me since then. That makes me unique within UC, so I'll say jonesbr.uc.edu, and notice that it figures it out here. edu.uc.jonesbr, and then underneath that, my application name, because while jonesbr is unique within UC, I could have multiple applications. That looks good. If I don't like that, I can click Edit, but no, we'll just leave it at the default. Now, really important, what happens to this? This goes into our build.gradle file as the application ID right here. You see in the plant places, it's called com.plantplaces. Remember that guy? That's our unique identifier that goes onto the Google Play Store right up here. So that name that you choose is very important. As a matter of fact, I did some refactoring once on plant flashcards, and I mistakenly completely messed up that unique identifier. I made it a really long com.com.plantflashcards.com.plantflashcards, just a matter of refactoring. Did not realize it until I deployed it. When I realized how god-awful that domain name was, I unpublished the app, fixed it, made it com.plantflashcards, and then republished the app, and that's the unique identifier of the app right now. So that name is important. It is also going to determine this package structure here in our Project Explorer, which is essentially the series of file folders where our source code lives. Before leaving the screen, I want to show something that is surprisingly hidden, because it's actually fairly popular now. You see, this isn't the bottom of the screen. Let me scroll up and take a look at this little guy, include Kotlin support. If you want to do Kotlin in your app, it's a good idea to go ahead and tick that box right now. The trick is, if this doesn't happen to be in a full screen mode, you don't even notice that. So just be careful, it's a bit hidden. So this is going to make first of all, it's going to make a project under C users UCINT, documents UC plant places. And I might just go ahead and make this plant places mobile so I don't confuse it with anything else. Underneath that directory, it's then going to make another directory called edu, UC, and then another jonesbr, and yet another plant places, and that's where all of our source code is going to go. Just to make sure, I'll go ahead and copy this project location. We'll check back on that in just a moment. I'm good with this screen. I'm going to choose Next. Now, here's, of course, some more important information, and be careful here. This is something that I figured out after pulling my hair out. There's no scroll bar here, but if you pull up, you will notice there are actually more options down here, and that kind of can drive you nuts. If you're looking for them, you don't see them because there's no scroll bar. So this is something you kind of want to do in a monitor that has a fairly high resolution. So, okay, let's see. What API do we want to target? Well, okay, we have some options here. So API 21, 22, 27, all the way up to 28. These match with the commonly known English names, Lollipop, Marshmallow, Nougat, Oreo. Frankly, I never remember the English names. If someone says, are you running Android Oreo? I'm like, hell, I don't know. I'm running Android 26. So those numbers and those names, for the most part, are a pretty close match. So what we need to decide is how far back do we want to support, how many Android operating system versions do we want to support? And it might say, well, gosh, give me all of them. Let's start with 4.0. I don't recommend that. I don't recommend that because you're going to spend a lot of time dealing with backwards compatibility. Generally, you want to kind of pick a big number. So you know the difference between 4.0 and 4.3 is insignificant. I mean, it's not very significant. 4.0 to 4.1, again, not a big jump, but 4 to 5 is a fairly big jump. So pick one of these big numbers like Lollipop. Now, the nice thing is, when you do that, it tells you how many Android devices are running that version or greater. And here it says 71.3%. But keep in mind that a lot of times you might hold on to your old phone when you get a new phone, and so it might be active, might even still be on your Wi-Fi, but you might not be updating it. You might not even be using it. So you want to target a large number of devices, but don't go for every last percent. That's my advice. One thing that's handy when you do deploy your application, you can, we'll go to Plant Places Mobile here, and this is the Google Play console. This is what you see as a developer when you've deployed your application. Go to Statistics, and there's all kinds of great stuff here. So if I scroll down a little bit, we can see so the Plant Places Mobile right now has 132 active users, over 2,000 downloads total, but 132 people currently have it running on a device. And so this shows us what devices those individuals are using. And I can make a judgment call here and say, okay, I have 9 people on Android 4. That looks like about it. Am I okay targeting 5 and greater from now on? There's a good chance those are dormant users. So yeah, I'm comfortable getting 5 or greater. But nonetheless, this gives you an idea of the Android operating system that is being used for your application. So you can make a fairly good judgment here. Okay, I'll go ahead and choose Next. Now, when we're starting a project, we have an option to start with the default activity, or we can start with none at all. We can go with Add No Activity. You might as well give yourself a start. So, Basic Activity is probably one of my favorites. Now, a word of caution, think very carefully about your first screen and what it's going to be. And by that I mean, Android's guideline is that the first screen of your app should be the screen that users want to use 80% of the time. In other words, avoid a main menu. I made this mistake. I had a main menu in my very first app. It had a lot of words in it, which is confusing to the user. Number 2, it puts everything at the same priority. So I had change your settings at the same priority as search by color. Change your settings is probably something you're not going to do much. Search plants by color is probably why you've downloaded the app. Number 3, it's an additional click. So it takes the user one more click to the screen they want to go to. So avoid a main menu. You might think you really need one, but really think about avoiding that. If you think you need a main menu, ask yourself, do I have too many screens? Can I make this a single screen application? That's the holy grail. Number 2, a lot of people are tempted to force logon immediately. Don't do that. Let the user play with your app for free and go ahead and play around in there if you can. Obviously, if it's a banking app, that's not going to work. But if your app permits it, let the user play around in your app for free and only force logon when required. So I've seen people do things like food rating apps or something like that, and they force logon immediately. And my question is there really private data here? You just want to know the rating for this restaurant. Do you have to log in for that? Well, probably not. Now, do you want to rate a restaurant? Okay, then you need to log in. So hold off the login until the user wants to do a rating, but let the user see other users' ratings for free. Users just don't like to have to create an account to get into an app. So no main menu, no login activity, wipe those out. Try to avoid a splash screen unless you're actually loading data at startup and it's going to take a while. But really what you can do, again, depending on your business needs, is show an old view of the data and then refresh that view in the background and then update it. That can, in some applications that can work better than a loading screen. So basic activity is one of my favorite. You see there are several other options here. Master detail flow, good for tablets. Nav drawer is pretty cool. Scrolling. I can't imagine your first screen would be a settings activity, but several options. Now, the next screen, we get to name some things. What is the name of our first activity? An activity is a Java class that handles things like button clicks, autocompletes, things like that. In other words, it's essentially the controller of a model view controller. So I might call this first activity something like GPS a plant. Notice that the layout name is activity GPS a plant. Remember, there are actually two files generated, one called activity, the other one called content. Title, GPS a plant. Let's go ahead and put some spaces in there, make that more readable. Use a fragment. That's a conversation we'll hold for a later day, kind of a more detailed. I have some videos on fragments in my on my channel. And then hierarchical parent, so who's our superclass? Okay, create a new basic activity with an app bar. I think that's what we want. So let's go ahead and choose finish, and it will take a few moments for this to grind. Remember that name GPS a plant, and we'll let this crank for just a little bit, and then we'll look at the results. Now let's take a look at what generated. First of all, we have the two layout files that I promised, the activity GPS a plant, which has that floating action button, and the content, which is where we put most of our buttons and text fields and the like. It can be a bit confusing on what goes in what layout versus another. This is a newer concept in Android, came out in the last few years. Now we also want to take a look at that Gradle file, so I'm going to hold press Shift 2 times. In Android Studio, that's one of your best friends because it lets you search for files. So I'm going to say build.gradle, and there are a couple versions. The one that I want is in app, and here it is. So first of all, compile SDK version and target SDK version. That means that we are essentially writing this project targeting SDK version 26, which I think that's Nougat or Oreo. See, I told you I don't remember the names. We're saying that we will provide backward compatibility all the way to SDK version 21, also known as Android 5, which I want to say is Lollipop, but there again, don't trust me. I forget the names as they correspond with the numbers. Okay, so that is our Android stuff. Here's the application ID that I promised, edu.uc.jonesbr.plantplaces, and once again, that's what we're going to see in our application ID in the Play Store. So that's very important. It's part of our URL. Version code and version name. This is important because this is what the user is going to see. Again, on your Play Store listing, as we go down a little bit, you're going to see the current version here, which is 15.1 in this case. So note, anytime you upload a new APK, you need to bump this number, because if not, you'll upload it and the Play Store will say, no can do, the version number is the same as a previous version. So that has to be unique. Just remember to bump that up one number each time you update the app. As a general rule, I've never released something called 1.0. I think that kind of makes people nervous. So a lot of times I'll come in, even if it's the first app. I think the other app I have is Plant Flashcards. I think the first version I released of that was 2.1 or something. So 1.0 kind of makes people nervous. Now, if we scroll down a bit in the build Gradle file, we'll see a series of dependencies, and these are the libraries that we say that we want to use in our application. So, as I said, for a basic Android project, you can run with this. But very quickly, you'll find out that you need things like Google Maps and maybe the AdMob, and that's in the Google Play Services library, so you'll need to add that. Maybe Glide for image caching, that's a common one. Butterknife for getting our components off of our Android screen and using them in our application. Several others, as a Dagger, there are several others that are commonly used. As a matter of fact, what some people will do is just set up a bootstrap project, which essentially has all these dependencies in it already. So then if you're creating Android projects new all the time, you kind of start with this bootstrap. Okay, let's go to Java. Take a look. You probably notice the package name over here. Let me just scroll this over a little bit. So edu.uc, remember that. And then JonesBR, my unique Bearcat ID. And then Plant Places is a package name. Now you see three things that look kind of identical here. You might wonder what the difference is. This is the top folder is where you're going to do most of your work. Okay, underneath that, you're going to see test, which is traditional unit tests that don't understand the context of Android. In other words, it doesn't know what an activity is, it doesn't know what a broadcast receiver is, so on and so forth. Android test, these are tests that do understand the Android ecosystem and do know what an activity is. So two different places to put your tests. This is one thing where you might think, oh, I just want to write an app, I don't want to write tests. Don't do that. In Android, I strongly encourage you to consider behavior-driven design or test-driven design, because that's going to ensure, number one, quality of your application, or at least make it better than not having those tests. But number two, it's going to help you design a good application. Poorly written code is hard to unit test. So if you write the unit test first, you're more likely to write well-written code. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so underneath this now we have our application. And here we go. This is a bit of Kotlin. If you don't recognize it, your activity can either be Kotlin or Java. And that was one of the settings we set in one of the very first screens. So at this point, we have the shell of an application, something that we can deploy, something that we can run with. A whole lot more to go from here, but this is a good start. Thank you.